Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey. On this episode, I'm joined by Andrew McElheran. Andrew's a partner in our Meridian office out of Toronto. And Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. It's good to be here with you today.
So, managing a corporation is full of uncertainty. There are the classic business challenges such as changing competition, managing expenses, and motivating talent, which every company must address. However, the difficulty of establishing effective compensation arrangements can become daunting when you factor in the growing macroeconomic, geopolitical, and regulatory uncertainty. In this unpredictable environment, how can companies establish resilient executive compensation arrangements that stand the test of time? On today's episode, we'll explore executive compensation design principles and approaches that are best suited to uncertainty. Andrew, I want to start with kind of a basic question around this topic. What makes compensation design, quote unquote, resilient?
Yeah, it's a great question to start us off because a lot of times you only know your program is resilient once it's been proved to not be resilient. And after the fact, it's a little harder to close the barn door after all of the animals have bolted.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of ways that we can answer that question. First, sort of basic level question, is the design such that it doesn't need to be revised regularly? Does it stand the test of time in good circumstances as well as bad circumstances? Now, obvious caveat, particularly where we are in history, you can't design for all contingencies and the sort of black swan events or disruptions out of the blue like pandemics. So many companies found themselves having to make adjustments more or less on the fly because nobody was anticipating a pandemic when it hit us. So with that caveat in mind, though, a good test is, do you need to revise your design? It seems every year because something changed and all of a sudden it's not working for what you're trying to do as a company. A second important principle, we like to say we start from what the business needs, but it's a pretty good design principle in the service of resiliency if what you're doing is recognizably within market guidelines. So if you have something that's completely exotic and nobody else in the world does it, that's likely to create a bit of consternation and frustration on the part of external observers. So you're seeking essentially a bit of a balance between what is recognizably a market aligned or approximately market aligned plan that is also helping you serve the business objectives you're trying to reach. And as we talk today, I think you'll find balance is going to be a recurring theme with me.
Yeah.
And a third, and this one's a bit more subtle, but I think it's pretty important, which is if your design requires you to do something odd with the way you're evaluating performance, since so much of senior executive compensation is linked to performance, then it's probably not a resilient design. An example would be if a company consistently says, we're going to set your pay opportunities very low by market standards, but then I'm going to do that again because my phone is asleep. An example would be if a company sets pay opportunities for senior executives very low when you consider how much of senior executive compensation is delivered through vehicles that are linked to performance, then you find yourself in a position where you might have to be essentially an easy grader on performance in order to deliver market aligned compensation. And so that's a kind of corruption of the performance measurement process that we don't usually like very much. The same logic works in the opposite direction. You could be setting pay opportunities very high relative to market, and that gives you the opportunity to be very punitive with your assessment of performance. It may not actually match how performance is actually unfolding.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. You mentioned the principle of simplicity, I think was one of the first things you mentioning there, and definitely find that true. You can take that to the extreme and say we could just pay everybody base salary, and that's probably going to be the most resilient design we could think of. But obviously, everything you trade off motivation and alignment to shareholders and lots of other things. So it's always like with everything, it's what's the right sweet spot where it's simple enough to be resilient, but still accomplishes the list of other things that we're trying to accomplish with executive pay.
Exactly right. And that trade-off between simplicity and complexity is one that we encountered again and again. In being compensation professionals ourselves, we probably we have more affinity for complicated designs. But I think we've learned that overly complicated designs, you lose all incentive properties in particular because nobody understands what they're supposed to do.
Yep. Yep. So a great overview of kind of the principles we're trying to accomplish. So now let's dive into some of the actual design aspects and techniques you might consider if you're building in resilience. So what are some of the things you'd point out that help build in resilience from a design perspective?
Again, to start from that with a compensation professional's hat on, one of the things I try and keep in mind is what is resilient from one company to the next is going to depend a little bit on how that company likes to pay people, what its pay philosophy is. And when I talk about pay philosophy, I'm not usually using the usual boilerplate about attract, motivate, retain, incent, whatever the words are that we see fairly often. I'm talking about trade-offs. One of those we just mentioned, which is the trade-off between simple and complicated, simple and imprecise, complicated and more precise. There isn't really a right or a wrong answer to that question, but the right incentive compensation design is going to strike a balance somewhere. And so you understand if you're interested in a more complicated design that's going to give you better precision and measurement, or a simpler design that's going to give you less precision and measurement. Another very important one from my perspective is how comfortable are decision makers with using judgment, or if you like, intervening over the final assessment of performance and therefore the final assessment of pay outcomes. If you have decision makers who don't like using judgment, that's going to steer you in the direction of different types of designs that don't require the insertion of judgment, or that are less likely to require the insertion of judgment in order to ensure a fair outcome. By contrast, if you have decision makers who either are comfortable with, or in some cases really like using judgment, that takes you in different plan design directions with more discretion built in. Another good design principle, which I think is almost universal, although again, go back to what the business needs, is we tend to favor at least a little bit of diversification in terms of how many vehicles you're using across the program and what sort of measurement, performance measurement metrics do you plan to use. And a statement we sometimes make, if it's a one variable plan, it's probably a brittle plan. And we encountered that a lot during the pandemic. Companies that had a single earnings-based metric determining most of performance-based compensation, for example, found themselves on the wrong side of their earnings forecast. And the third, this one is, now we're getting a little more down into the weeds and the mechanics. I think it's generally a good principle to have more than one measurement standard in place. For example, if you're measuring an annual bonus plan based on, we set a goal for the year in earnings, let's use earnings as an example, and then we measure performance against that earnings goal at the end of the year. That's great. But when you're measuring performance over more than a 1 year period, your ability to forecast accurately, it gets very difficult very quickly for most companies. And so one of the ways we promote resiliency is by saying, well, if we're measuring over a more than 1 year period, some of the performance criteria will be based on a goal that we set now, but some of it might be based on a different yardstick of performance, like a relative standard for performance. So then you're not putting so much pressure on yourself to be an accurate forecaster. You're just saying relative to some market reference, we need to outperform. And that will determine if we get paid more than the initial value of the pay opportunity.
Yep. Yep. On the point you were making around judgment and discretion, and the building in an element of that can provide some resilience because it allows some flexing of the incentive. Have you seen in the clients you work with an uptick in that in recent years, just given all of the things that from COVID to the, geopolitical world and everything else we've had to deal with? Have you seen that increase at all in any of your clients?
I'd say on balance, yes. I think some companies that were formerly not very comfortable using discretion found that it actually does have some merits. And so if the standard before might have been many companies relying on a formula, what you find is a few more companies are, it's a formula, but we tag on a discretionary step at the end just to make sure that the outcomes are fair.
Hmm.
Following along the spectrum, I do think there are more companies that have embraced discretion as a core element of the program. And they say, we're not going to be precise. We're not going to follow a formula, but we're going to consider a wide variety of performance criteria at the end of the cycle, and then we'll make a judgment. Now, that latter type of design isn't going to find favor everywhere. So there are some external observers like the proxy advisors, if your company is publicly listed, they're not going to be too impressed by a program that adds more discretion to what's already there. But if we set aside their perspective and just focus on what companies are doing, I think the direction of travel is definitely towards from no use of discretion to more limited, and in some cases from limited use of discretion to more comprehensive.
Yep. Okay. So that kind of dovetails into the next question I wanted to ask is really around the goals and objectives themselves. So you've established a plan, you've got a structure, you've got incentives and whatnot. But of course, now the committee and the management team have to come to agreement around what are the right objectives for the coming year or potentially multiple years. We're talking about a long-term plan. So what are some approaches to evaluating goals and setting goals that might offer some resilience into the system?
Yeah, so this is, we're now at tertiary levels of discussion around making your program resilient. This one, I'd be a little less concerned if you were revising the shape of your performance payout curve every year or every cycle. I do think you can give yourself a little more latitude to change things up there. But let's say for a second, you've got the right vehicles in place. It's approximately market aligned. You're measuring performance on more than a single variable. So you've got diversification. And let's further say somewhere in the program design, you're using both a relative standard for performance and an absolute standard. You set a goal and then you try and achieve that goal. What's left? And I think the answer there is when you look at your performance goals, there's a whole array of considerations around how do we know we have enough stretch and targets? And philosophically, do we want to set ourselves, for example, a fairly stretchy goal at plan, but we're going to give ourselves lots of downside protection if we don't make plan because it's a stretchy goal initially? Or you could say equivalently, it's going to be a little bit of a softer goal at plan, but you're not, it's going to take significant outperformance to earn significantly more than an on plan result in terms of your pay outcome. Both of those, I think, are defensible positions, again, grounded in what do you want your pay philosophy to be, where, again, people who have an affinity for executive pay designs, they can spend too much time calibrating these performance payout curves very finely. So a little tweak here, we're going to pay more, a little tweak there, we're going to pay less. And while that's tempting, we often caution that you're starting to lose that trade-off between simplicity and complexity. You're adding complexity because very few people will be able to follow along and understand exactly what they need to do at a given place on your performance curve to generate the right outcome. Useful tool, but used with caution is what we might say.
Hmm. Yep. No, excellent thoughts. So I want to step back, and if I'm in the seat of many of our listeners, I'm probably thinking, okay, I think my programs are resilient. We've tried to build in some resiliency, but there's a lot of uncertainty going into the future here. What are some ways that I can test? What are some ways that I can look at our current program and test to see is it sufficiently resilient, or are there things we should be changing? Any words of advice you'd have there?
Yeah. So I think you approach this, you do some tests, and if the tests are positive, then you say, we might have a problem. Our program might not be resilient enough. Obviously, there's no, resiliency scale where you can just put it into a machine and a number comes out and that number tells you how resilient your program is.
Mhm.
Go back to what we said at the start of this discussion. First test is, and I've heard this from corporate directors from time to time, it feels like we're revising our program every single year. It doesn't feel right to me. We need to build something that stands the test of time a bit better. So that would be the first test. If you are revising the program more often than people are comfortable with, that's your first sign. And pretty easy test, honestly, to ask yourself, maybe there's something to be done here. Second, a little less you hear from corporate directors, but a little more from compensation professionals or HR professionals. Do we have a defined pay philosophy? And if so, are we stepping inside of it on too regular a basis? And if the answer to that question is yes, then that also might say there might be some issue with the durability of our program here. When you get past those sort of initial building blocks, there are some harder tests that, again, aren't going to give you an answer, but they're going to give you clues. One of those would be, have you evaluated whether you've got pay for performance alignment? And partly this is a formal analysis retrospectively. Look at performance your company has delivered. Look at the pay outcomes for senior executives. Do you have alignment there? One specific and fairly easy test you can do is, are your payout factors on your annual bonus plan and your long-term performance share plan, if you're using one, Do those line up with what other companies are doing? Or are you consistently in the place where they're paying out close to target and you're paying out significantly above or significantly below target? If it's that latter case, I'd say there might be a resiliency problem that bears further investigation. And then probably from the HR team, the management team's perspective, we throw around words like we've got retention issues fairly often in our business. But what I would say is if you have documented evidence of retention problems, so identified cases of regrettable turnover, particularly at senior executive level, you wanted to keep them, but they wanted to leave. That's a real clue that there's some problem with the durability of the program, particularly if when the person leaves, they say compensation was one of the reasons they're leaving.
Yeah.
So honestly, that's probably the brightest line. If you've got that fact, that tells me that you should look a little more carefully.
Yeah. No, excellent things to be on the lookout for. And I know with all of our clients are looking at these issues as we go into the middle of the year here, start thinking about designs for the future. It's a great way to test your programs. And although I think we all hope for a little bit more calmness in the economic environment and general space, I don't think anybody's predicting that's going to be the case. Resilience is definitely something to keep in mind as we think through designs. So, Andrew, this has been really great. Thanks for joining the podcast today. This great information, great conversation today.
Thanks, Ryan. Great pleasure.